You know, Drew Peterson was a police sergeant with a 30-year career. He was a guy who was supposed to uphold the law, right? But when his fourth wife just vanished, a much, much darker picture started to emerge. A picture of a man who might be using his badge to hide a terrible, terrible secret. So this whole case, it really makes you wonder, right? When the person you're supposed to trust is the one under suspicion, who do you even turn to? Let's try and unravel this really complex and chilling story. Okay, so it all kicks off with one woman's disappearance, an event that would unravel this whole web of suspicion and force everyone to re-examine a death that had been considered a closed case for years. So this was the story Drew Peterson was telling. He claimed his young wife, Stacy, just called him up one day to say she was leaving him for someone else. Seemed like a simple, if sad, explanation, but her family, they didn't buy it for a second. They knew something was seriously wrong, and that's when the search for Stacy really began. And when you look at this timeline, you can see exactly why suspicion fell on Drew so fast. Just a few years before Stacy disappeared, his third wife, Kathleen Savio, died under some very, very strange circumstances. So with Stacy now missing, you can bet investigators started looking at Kathleen's death with a fresh pair of eyes. So this is where a missing person case starts to turn into something much, much darker. Authorities were basically forced to reopen a file that had been stamped accidental. Get this, Kathleen Savio was found in a bathtub that was completely dry. Now, at the time, her death was ruled an accident. But with Stacy gone, investigators knew they had to take a much closer look. They made the huge decision to exhume her body for a second autopsy. And wow. The difference here is just, it's night and day. The first ruling, back in 2004, accidental drowning. But after her body was exhumed in 2007, that ruling was officially changed to something way more sinister, homicide. You know, this second autopsy, it was done by the famous pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, and it painted a totally different picture. It revealed a violent struggle, we're talking extensive bruising, and a deep gash on her head. The evidence was suddenly crystal clear. This was no accident. Kathleen Savio had been murdered. So they had a new cause of death, and prosecutors finally had a real case. But getting a conviction against Drew Peterson for Kathleen's murder, well, that was going to require changing the law itself. Okay, so to really get this trial, you have to understand a concept called hearsay. Basically, you can't just use he said, she said evidence in a courtroom. The person who actually made the statement has to be there to be cross-examined. But what happens when your key witnesses are, dead or missing? And this is where things get really wild. The Illinois legislature passed a brand new law specifically because of this case, and they actually called it Drew's Law. It created this very narrow exception. If you could prove the defendant likely got rid of a witness just to silence them, then their statements could be heard by a jury. You can just imagine this law basically blew the doors wide open for the prosecution. Their entire case was built on these powerful and frankly spooky hearsay statements. Jurors were about to hear what Kathleen Savio and Stacy Peterson had told people in the months and years right before they died. And this was the absolute bombshell testimony. Stacy Peterson's own pastor got on the stand and testified that she had confessed her deepest fears to him. She told him that Drew had murdered Kathleen and made it look like an accident. Just a chilling accusation, coming, it seemed, from beyond the grave. So, the trial was a huge win for the prosecution. But if you think Drew Peterson's story ends there with a guilty verdict and a long prison sentence, well, you'd be wrong. His criminal story was far from over. In 2013, Drew Peterson got 38 years in prison for murdering Kathleen Savio. For a lot of people, this felt like the final chapter. But Peterson wasn't done yet. I mean, you're not going to believe this. While he's in prison, Peterson starts plotting another murder. He actually tried to hire an inmate to kill James Glasgow, the very prosecutor who put him away. What he didn't know was that the inmate was wearing a wire recording every single word. And for that crime, he was convicted of solicitation of murder for hire, and another 40 years got tacked onto his sentence. His earliest possible release date? 2081. He is absolutely going to die in prison. But even with Drew Peterson locked away for life, that one big, nagging question from the very beginning of this whole saga, it's still just hanging in the air, completely unanswered. The very case that kicked this whole thing off, it's still open. While everyone believes he's the only suspect in his fourth wife's disappearance, without a body or a confession, Stacy Peterson is still officially just a missing person. There's been no justice for her at all. And to make this whole thing even more twisted and disturbing, his own former lawyer, Joel Brodsky, has publicly hinted that he knows what happened to Stacy. But he says he's bound by attorney-client privilege. It's just a cruel suggestion that the secret to her disappearance might be locked away forever. So that's where we're left. Drew Peterson is behind bars for murder and for plotting another one. But the mystery of Stacy Peterson, the young mother whose disappearance exposed everything, that remains locked away with him. You have to wonder, will her family ever get the answers they deserve?